Okay, so you guys have sent in some really thought-provoking material,
Yeah.
excerpts from something called pasted text,
Right.
and it really gets into the future of Afghanistan on the global stage.
Absolutely.
So I think for this deep dive, what we're going to try to do is
Yeah.
look beyond the headlines right now, the current crises, and really try to grasp the potential roles that Afghanistan might play as these global power dynamics continue to shift.
Yeah, and I think, for centuries, Afghanistan has found itself at this incredible intersection.
Yeah.
If you think back to, that original great game between empires vying for influence, and then look at how the Sykes-Picot Agreement reshaped the Middle East.
Right.
And, now we're hearing whispers again of this new Middle East that's kind of resurfacing.
Yeah, like that's a really interesting point, like this new Middle East idea.
Yeah.
And you combine that with this U.S. focus on managing China's rise.
All right.
It really does feel like the old playbooks are being tossed out.
Yep.
Yeah. The U.S. increasingly needs regional partners who can stand on their own 2 feet.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to, I think, the central questions that your sources raise.
Yeah.
Will Afghanistan simply go back to being a geopolitical tool?
Yeah.
A piece moved across this larger board? Or is there a genuine possibility that it could emerge as an independent actor?
Yeah, I think the source material actually calls Afghanistan a geopolitical knot, which is
Oh, like
a
that.
pretty apt description.
Yeah.
It's situated in this incredibly sensitive location as all these global strategies are being redefined
Right.
and regional and global players are realigning their interests.
And it's not just about who's trying to influence Afghanistan.
Right.
It's about how Afghanistan itself might be leveraged in these bigger contests.
Exactly.
So this is where it gets really interesting and where I think the source material offers a pretty unique perspective.
Yeah.
It suggests that Afghanistan isn't just this passive territory,
Right.
that it could actually be a key player in several really critical areas, from acting as a check on China's ambitions to managing Iran's regional influence,
Yeah.
balancing, the complex dynamics of Central Asia, whether that's with or against Russia,
Right.
and even playing a role in potential crises involving Pakistan.
Absolutely.
That's a surprising amount of potential leverage
It is.
for a country that's facing so many challenges.
Yeah, and I think that leads us directly to the first key theme that your source explores,
Okay.
Afghanistan as a geopolitical tool.
Okay.
And they introduce this concept of a new great game.
A new great game, right? Because it's not the same as that.
Right. It's not the same as the old
Straightforward East versus West.
East versus West.
That we saw during the Cold War.
Exactly. It's a much more intricate puzzle. Now you've got rising powers like China, India,
Yeah.
and Iran in the mix,
Right.
alongside the traditional heavyweights, the U.S. and Russia.
Right.
And then you add to that all of the regional players with their own distinct and often conflicting agendas.
So many competing interests.
So many competing interests.
Yeah.
It's a much more crowded and complex playing field than it used to be.
And, there's been this flurry of recent diplomatic activity.
Right.
Zalmay Khalilzad's visit alongside Trump's hostage affairs envoy.
Yeah.
The Taliban's release of a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, your source interprets this as a signal of a return to U.S. bargaining diplomacy
Right.
with Kabul.
Interesting.
Not necessarily a move towards formal recognition,
Right.
but certainly a way to keep those channels open for various potential future scenarios.
Okay, so when we consider that alongside some of the other rumblings in the region,
Right.
like the reappearance of figures like Haqqani,
Yeah.
Pakistan's sudden accusations aimed at both the Taliban and India, even the potential for some level of U.S.-Russia understanding regarding Ukraine.
Yeah.
These all seem to hint at these behind-the-scenes adjustments
Right.
and a possible reshuffling of roles in the region with Afghanistan right in the middle of it all.
Right at the center, absolutely.
Yeah. So a major area of focus, I think, as your source rightly points out, is Afghanistan's potential role in strategies aimed at managing China's influence.
Right.
And, we often hear about the naval deployments in the South China Sea,
Okay.
but the piece draws our attention to China's significant dependence on energy imports.
It does.
Those numbers were really striking. 70% of their oil is imported, with 80% of that flowing through the Malacca Strait.
Yeah.
And nearly half of their natural gas is also sourced internationally.
Right.
That's a considerable point of vulnerability.
Absolutely. The Malacca Strait represents a critical choke point.
Yeah.
and the U.S. along with its QA of 8 allies.
Right. And for folks listening at home, the QEA is that security dialogue
Judge.
between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia
Right.
aimed at promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when we bring Afghanistan into the equation,
Yeah.
your source argues that it becomes relevant in 2 key ways.
Okay.
Firstly, as a potential alternative transit route.
Right. So instead of relying on that vulnerable strait,
Right.
there's this possibility of energy and goods flowing through Afghanistan to reach China, India, Pakistan,
Right.
and maybe even extending, further into Europe eventually.
Exactly. But the second point is almost the opposite side of the same coin.
Yeah.
Afghanistan, as a region prone to instability, could actually serve to disrupt China's projects.
Interesting.
Things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. And for our listeners, that's essentially China's global development strategy.
Exactly, involving infrastructure investment and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, in particular the Gwadar port.
Right. So its instability can be just as strategically useful to some as its potential as a trade artery.
Exactly.
So Afghanistan's geography presents this kind of double-edged sword.
It does.
It's both a potential asset and a potential liability, all depending on, who's trying to wield it and for what purpose.
Right.
Now, the piece also dives into some really significant internal dynamic.
It does.
Specifically, the power struggles within the Taliban.
Yeah, this is a crucial layer to understand.
Yeah.
Your source highlights this deep and consequential divide between the Kandahar and Kabul factions within the Taliban.
Okay.
These aren't monolithic groups, and their internal disagreements have significant implications for Afghanistan's trajectory and its interactions with the international community.
So the Kandahar faction, as we learn, is led by Hibatullah Akhundzada.
That's right.
And they have pretty strong ideological connections to Iranian religious institutions.
They do, and they appear to be very resistant to any meaningful engagement with the West.
That sounds like a very firm stance.
It is. Their worldview is rooted in a particular interpretation of Islamic law and a deep-seated skepticism towards Western influence.
Okay.
The Kabul faction, in contrast, is portrayed as more pragmatic.
Yeah.
They seem more inclined to cooperate with regional stakeholders and even Western allies,
Yeah.
driven in part by this pressing need for economic relief. They understand that some level of reform and cooperation might be necessary to alleviate the severe economic pressures the country is facing.
And what's interesting is that your source points out that Iran seems to be aligning more closely with that Kandahar faction,
Yes.
while other regional and international actors who see value in engaging with the Taliban
Right.
are primarily dealing with that Kabul-based leadership.
That's right.
It's almost like we're seeing the early stages of proxy rivalries playing out within the Taliban.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These internal fissures create fertile ground for future proxy conflicts where external powers might strategically support one faction over another
Right.
to advance their own interests.
So it prevents the Taliban from presenting this unified front,
Exactly.
which further complicates this already intricate geopolitical landscape.
Absolute.
And, this leads us, I think, naturally to the growing influence of both China and Iran in Afghanistan over the past 3.5 years. And it's remarkable that they've managed to expand their presence without even formally recognizing the Taliban government.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly noteworthy here are their distinct approaches.
Okay.
Iran, especially in the western and southwestern provinces of Afghanistan, has been very strategic.
Right.
They've cultivated direct relationships with the Kandahar leadership through influential figures.
Okay.
But they're also employing softer power tactics,
Okay.
leveraging media outlets, religious institutions, and supporting local groups to build influence from the ground up.
So they're working all the angles.
They are, and China's approach appears to be more focused on the practicalities,
Yeah.
securing those vital mining concessions, and addressing their concerns about the East Turkestan Islamic movement.
Right.
This has led to both direct and indirect cooperation with the Taliban on security matters.
So both China and Iran are clearly pursuing their own specific interests.
Yeah.
And their increasing influence has undeniably altered the internal balance of power within Afghanistan and created new challenges for the U.S. and its allies, who now have to navigate these established and growing presences.
Yeah.
So looking ahead, what potential futures does your source outline?
Yeah.
They lay out 3 possible paths for Iran, and it's clear that whatever unfolds there will have repercussions for Afghanistan.
Huge repercussions, yeah.
So let's start with the scenario of Iran normalizing its relations with the West.
Okay.
What might that entail?
If Iran were to move towards normalization, your source suggests a notable shift in their foreign policy.
Okay.
They might distance themselves from the China-Russia axis,
Okay.
potentially scale back their support for proxy forces across the region, and even reconsider their nuclear and missile programs.
And what would that mean for Afghanistan?
The implications could be quite significant.
Yeah.
It's likely that Iranian backing for the Taliban or aligned groups would diminish,
Right.
potentially creating a power vacuum. But the piece suggests that this could actually open up opportunities for other regional and international powers, as well as for Afghan domestic forces to play a more prominent role.
So a reshuffling of the deck chairs almost.
Almost. It could even foster regional cooperation and attract investment if Afghan leaders can effectively capitalize on the situation.
Right. So that's the key.
That's a crucial caveat if they can capitalize on it.
Yeah.
The source also cautions that if those opportunities are missed, other actors will quickly move in to fill the void.
Yeah. The geopolitical game, as we said, rarely stands still.
Exactly.
So let's consider the opposite scenario. What if we see a military conflict erupt between Iran and the U.S. or Israel?
That sounds like a highly destabilizing prospect.
Yeah.
And your source suggests that Afghanistan could be involuntarily drawn into such a conflict.
Oh, wow.
There's the potential for Iran to view Afghan territory as providing strategic depth
Right.
to support its regional proxies,
Okay.
and even to incite aligned religious or political groups within Afghanistan against Western interests or their rivals.
So almost using Afghanistan as a staging ground?
In a way, yeah, and would likely see an increase in activity from anti-Iran groups operating within Afghanistan,
Right.
such as ISIS and Jaish-al-Adl.
Right. So kind of more the same proxy conflicts.
Exactly, further exacerbating those proxy conflicts.
Okay. So that's a pretty messy scenario.
It is this security situation within Afghanistan would undoubtedly become even more precarious,
Yeah.
and its international relations would suffer considerably.
Right.
And as your source points out, the West might intensify pressure on Afghanistan to actively prevent Iran from using its territory.
Right. So adding even more pressure to an already incredibly complex situation.
Absolutely.
The third potential future for Iran outlined in your source is perhaps the most unsettling internal collapse or significant instability.
Internal collapse. Yeah.
So the piece mentions the possibility of, escalating ethnic, religious, and economic protests within Iran,
Right.
particularly in provinces bordering Afghanistan like Sistan and Baluchistan,
Right.
and how this could spill across Afghanistan's western borders.
And this presents a very real and serious concern.
Right.
We could witness waves of refugees, heightened insecurity, and even increased religious tensions spreading into Afghanistan.
Right.
Extremist groups could exploit the resulting chaos to gain a stronger foothold.
Yeah.
And there's even the worrying possibility of Iran increasing its interference in Afghanistan as a means of diverting attention from its own internal problems.
Right. So almost like a wag the dog kind of situation.
Exactly.
Let's shift our focus a little bit to India.
Yeah.
Your source also sheds light on India's strategic objectives in Afghanistan.
It does. It portrays India as an ascendant Asian power with an increasingly important role in the region's geopolitics.
Right. And they view Afghanistan, I think, through the prism of their ongoing competition with both China and Pakistan,
They do.
considering both security and economic dimensions.
Absolutely. And they've been actively working to establish a stable and positive presence
Right.
through significant development investments.
Right. Things like the Salma Dam, the Afghan parliament building.
Exactly. Projects like that come to mind,
Yep.
as well as through various soft power initiatives and regional cooperation efforts, such as their involvement in the Chabahar port project in Iran.
So these multifaceted efforts are all aimed at counterbalancing China's growing influence
They are?
and mitigating any potential threats emanating from that China-Pakistan axis.
Absolutely.
And the piece also reminds us that India is a key strategic partner of the U.S.
Right.
within that QID security framework,
Exactly.
viewing Afghanistan as part of that broader Western strategic alignment aimed at managing China's rise.
Precisely.
So as these regional rivalries continue to intensify,
Yeah.
India's role in shaping Afghanistan's future, both in terms of security and economic development, is likely to become even more critical.
I think so. So they have significant interests vested in a stable and non-hostile Afghanistan.
Now let's turn our attention to Pakistan,
Okay.
whose situation, according to your source, appears to be increasingly fragile.
It-
It mentions this confluence of escalating ethnic, political security, religious, and economic crises.
Yeah, it paints a rather concerning picture.
It does. And compounding those internal pressures,
Right.
Pakistan is also facing external pressure from both India and the United States to distance itself from its close relationship with China.
Yeah,
So your source even raises the possibility of a gradual weakening of the Pakistani military and the potential for denuclearization.
that's right,
Whoa.
which would have profound and far-reaching implications for the entire region.
So what would be the direct consequences for Afghanistan?
The piece suggests a potential destabilization of Afghanistan's eastern border regions,
Okay.
increased tensions in those areas, and a possible mobilization of Balak and Pashtun ethnic groups, along with other disenfranchised factions.
Right.
It could potentially lead to a significant redrawing of the region's political map.
So essentially, a fragile or collapsing Pakistan
Right.
would introduce a whole new set of complex security challenges for Afghanistan and the wider region.
Yeah, it could become a breeding ground for further instability and cross-border conflicts.
Right, adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
Absolutely.
So, given all of these intricate internal and external forces at play,
Right.
your source distills Afghanistan's potential future into three primary scenarios.
It does.
So the first of these is what they term stabilization of controlled instability.
Right.
So in this scenario, the Taliban remain the dominant power,
Yes.
but continue to face significant internal divisions and external pressures.
Right.
They would struggle to achieve widespread legitimacy, both domestically and internationally,
Yeah.
leading to the state of, ongoing yet perhaps somewhat contained crisis.
Right.
The second scenario offers a more optimistic outlook.
Okay.
It's gradual integration into the global order.
Gradual integration.
So this envisions a potential shift in Taliban leadership,
Right.
perhaps with the removal of Mullah Haibatullah and his more hardline allies,
Yeah.
the appointment of a new, more pragmatic leader, and the implementation of some limited reforms that could lead to a degree of international recognition.
Yeah, this path would likely involve a softening of some of their more restrictive policies
Right.
and a greater willingness to engage with the international community.
On issues like human rights counterterrorism.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
It represents a possible, albeit limited, path towards some level of international acceptance.
The third and most transformative scenario
Right.
is labeled transformation from within.
Transformation from within.
This envisions the emergence of a new political force
Right.
driven by growing internal discontent,
Okay.
potentially with some level of external backing.
Right. And the crucial factor here, according to your source, is whether this emerging force
Yeah.
can articulate a compelling national, transnational, and independent vision.
So a new vision for Afghanistan
A new vision, exactly.
that has the potential to truly disrupt the existing order.
Right.
So this scenario hinges on genuine grassroots mobilization and the articulation of a compelling alternative to the Taliban's rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It would require a unifying ideology that resonates with a broad spectrum of the Afghan population
Right.
and the ability to garner both domestic and international support.
So it's a tall order.
It is a tall order.
It's pretty sobering to read that section in your source on lost opportunities and closing windows.
Yeah.
It reflects on the past 2 decades and how Afghanistan had genuine chances
Yeah.
to evolve into a more independent actor,
Right.
or at the very least to have a more influential voice in shaping its own destiny.
Right. It's a critical reflection.
And your source points to several contributing factors that led to these missed opportunities. They used pervasive corruption, a lack of cohesive national consensus, regional interference that often undermined the U.S. presence, ineffective political leadership,
Right.
and an over-reliance on foreign aid.
Right.
And the reality now, under the Taliban's control,
Right.
and with no significant organized opposition to speak of,
Right.
is that those windows of opportunity are rapidly closing.
They are the great game, as the piece frames it, right, appears to be entering its final stages of formation, and Afghanistan risks being locked into a predetermined role within that larger strategic landscape.
So that's precisely why I think the final section of your source, focusing on rebuilding national image for independent action, is so vital.
It underscores that for Afghanistan to transition from being a geopolitical tool to an independent actor, it must actively work to rebuild its political and national identity.
And an identity that truly reflects the diversity of its ethnicities, its movements, and its generations.
Absolutely.
So this rebuilding process, the piece argues, necessitates several key elements.
It does.
The establishment of an inclusive and justice-oriented national dialogue,
Right.
moving beyond exclusionary policies and rigid ideological stances,
Yeah.
and forging a new social contract based on coexistence and genuine political participation?
Exactly. It's a significant undertaking.
It is, but your source is clear on this point.
Yeah.
Without a shared and just national narrative that resonates across the Afghan people,
Right.
overcoming the role of a pawn in regional politics will be impossible.
Right. The internal strength and unity of the Afghan people
Right.
are presented as the ultimate key to achieving true independence.
So to bring it all together,
Yeah.
your source highlights these key developments.
Right.
The U.S. delegation's visit,
Right.
the return of Haqqani,
Iran.
the increasing influence of both China and Iran, Pakistan's recent accusations, the ongoing tensions involving Iran.
Right.
All of these signal that Afghanistan is entering a new and exceptionally critical phase of this ongoing great game.
And the central insight drawing from Afghanistan's recent and more distant history
Right.
is that no single external power, be it the Taliban, the U.S., Iran, or China,
Right.
is likely to be the ultimate arbiter of Afghanistan's future.
It's too complex a situation.
It's too complex. The country's internal dynamics and the competing external interests are simply too complex and too deeply entrenched for any single actor to dictate the final outcome.
But the final message we take away from your source is one of potential agency.
It is.
So the Afghan people themselves, if they choose to unite and act,
Yeah.
have the capacity to transform their nation from a pawn in a larger game into an independent player on the world stage.
That's right.
The future, it suggests, is not yet written in stone.
That's a powerful and ultimately hopeful thought to conclude with.
It is.
The future trajectory of Afghanistan can be rewritten,
Right.
but it demands awareness, unity, and proactive engagement from the Afghan people themselves.
So what that agency truly means and how it can be effectively exercised within such a complex and high-stakes geopolitical environment is a profound question for all of us to consider.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Yeah.
I'll see you next time.
See you later.